Welcome, everybody, to my heatwave edition of YouTube Weather and Climate Office Hours. I don't usually have sessions on the weekends, but I will when there's an unusual or high impact weather event or fire event unfolding in California. And there is right now in the form of this ongoing heat wave. I've had several sessions over the past week. Wrote a blog post a little over a week ago on what was expected to be an intense, very prolonged, notably prolonged heat wave with very warm overnight and foothill temperatures and possibly record-breaking in some spots. And unfortunately, all of that has come to pass, and then some, perhaps. The peak of this heat wave is now arguably slightly even more intense, I think, than some of the original predictions might have suggested a week or so out. And I say that because there has already been at least one major climate station that has reported a new all-time record high temperature during this heat wave in California, and probably a few informal stations. That would be Palm Springs yesterday, hitting 124 degrees Fahrenheit. Had never done that before. And as I speak, just watching the thermometer up in the northern Sacramento Valley at Redding tick over to 118 degrees Fahrenheit, which ties the all-time record for that climate site. And that temperature is still on the way up, so there's a pretty good chance that at some point during this live office hour, Redding will set a new all-time record high temperature above 118 degrees. There are some other places that could see all-time record highs during this event, including places like Las Vegas and a few other spots in the northern Sacramento Valley. The all-time records are, of course, highly notable and significant, but perhaps even more significant in terms of the number of people and ecosystems it's affecting are the somewhat less than all-time record high temperatures, at least during the daytime, that are nonetheless have had huge impacts throughout the West and California in particular in recent days, as nighttime temperatures in some of the thermal belts in the hills have not dropped below 85 degrees for days in some places, and that is unfortunately going to continue. We got at least a few more days of that before very gradual cooling this week. For perspective, places like Sacramento remain above 100 degrees pretty much this whole week, and for much of the week above 105, although that will feel cool relative to, say, today, when temperatures there will likely be above 110. There has been some cooling along the coast as a very shallow marine layer has developed in recent days. That will probably make some more progress slightly inland, so there could be some stronger sea breezes, which on the plus side will cool areas within 20 miles of the coast or so, but could actually result in a localized band of high fire risk once again, as the legacy of this heat wave with super dry vegetation and unusually warm temperatures continuing, that strong sea breeze, even if it's onshore flow and a relatively humid breeze, could drive some grass and brush fires in places like the East Bay Hills, the Coast Ranges in various parts of California. So that'll be another secondary issue. The other piece I've been noticing today in particular is that this heat wave started out somewhat humid and then got really dry as the air mass compressed and dried out and warmed up even further. And it's still exceptionally dry right now in places like Redding that are either tying or exceeding, depending on what happens next time I look at the map, its all-time high temperature. But in some other places today, conditions are quite humid, unusually so for a California heat wave. And looking at some stations around the Bay Area right now, where dew points are between about 60 and 65 degrees Fahrenheit, that makes it quite muggy, and in fact means that the heat index, even though temperatures in the Bay Area right now are not record-breakingly warm for the most part, they're still quite hot, well into the 90s and low hundreds in some spots inland, and the humidity is not low. This is not a dry heat today by any means in the San Francisco Bay Area and in some other coastal spots, all the way from the Del Norte County coast down into central California. I think what's going on right now, because the nearshore ocean temperatures are not warmer than average, I actually think what's happening is that the presence of a very thin marine layer, we're talking a marine layer that is only a few hundred feet thick, is probably just enough to inject some marine moisture into that lower atmosphere in some spots, but not enough to bring fog or cooler temperatures. And so what you're getting is a combination, which is quite unusual, of humid air from the coast and hot air inland. And instead of just making it cool and foggy, it's actually making it hot and humid in these intermediate coastal zones right now. So in parts of the North Bay and East Bay and South Bay, quite humid today with temperatures in the 90s, meaning that the apparent temperature of the heat index is actually higher than the dry air temperature, which is unusual. Usually the low humidity, as I've talked about previously, is a mitigating factor. It allows you to sweat more effectively and cool your body. But right now, humidity is either allowing the temperature to feel exactly as it is or even be a little bit higher. So heat indices higher than actual temperatures, an unusual condition during heat waves, especially unusual given that this isn't a warm, humid air mass from the southeast. So this is not a monsoonal type ridge heat wave. This ridge is directly over Northern California, and so all of the moisture, I think, is essentially local. It's coming from the coast in that highly compressed marine layer. There was an interesting tweet from the Weather Service in the San Francisco Bay Area this morning pointing out that the top of Mount Tam in Marin County earlier this morning at about 9:30, the temperature was already about 95 degrees. That's a couple thousand feet up. But just 1,000 feet lower on the Panoramic Highway down the slopes, the temperature was in the mid-50s. So almost a 40-degree temperature spread over 1,000 vertical feet. I think illustrating what I'm talking about here, about a very shallow marine layer with extremely hot air right on top of it, allowing that intermediate zone to be really quite uncomfortably humid and hot at the same time. Whereas at the immediate coast, it's humid and cool, and then much farther inland, it's dry and extremely hot. But in that intermediate zone, it's humid and hot, and in some ways, that's the worst possible combination. That, by the way, is an example of a very strong temperature inversion, in which temperatures in the atmosphere increase with height rather than decreasing like they usually do. And frankly, I don't think I can recall having seen an inversion stronger than that 40-degree temperature rise on Mount Tam from the Panoramic Highway being in the mid-50s this morning to the top of Mount Tam being in the mid-90s. That is just an incredible temperature inversion, and as a testament, primarily, it's not like the lower levels of the atmosphere are cooler than usual, but it's a very unusual combination of a record hot air mass just a few hundred feet even above the surface in some cases, and a somewhat more ordinary air mass right along the coastal atmosphere right at the surface. So that's an incredible vertical contrast, and we're seeing some of these kind of crazy temperature inversion patterns earlier today across much of the state. Now, as the afternoon has gone on, that inversion has weakened because it just gets hotter everywhere, and that hotter air mass makes its way with mixing. It mixes more with the surface air, and you get hotter temperatures right down to the surface in a lot of cases. But there is this interesting combination of heat and humidity in the zone just far enough from the coast not to be cooled off by the marine layer. Sorry, Carl. But also far enough inland to remain really hot in this weak pattern with not very strong offshore or onshore winds, with a very strong ridge aloft. Remember that when we talk about ridges of atmospheric high pressure, what we mean is anomalously high pressure in mid-levels of the atmosphere, which doesn't always correspond with high pressure in the lowest levels of the atmosphere. The reason why this matters is it means you have what's known as subsidence, actual downward motion of the air. So literally sinking air, which, if you know anything about thermodynamics, in a setting where there is no energy lost from the system overall, in other words, an adiabatic system, when you compress air down to the surface, well, I should say, when you allow air to fall or you force air down to the surface, it's going to compress because, of course, pressure increases as you get closer to the surface of the Earth because there's more mass of air above your head the lower you are. And because it compresses, it warms and generally dries. And so you get compressional heating even from very weak subsident air mass because it's occurring over a long period of time or over a broad region. So essentially what ends up happening is you can get that air mass warms by compression. And for all of these reasons, we've been having some localized air quality issues as that lid on the atmosphere traps pollutants from some wildfires, and earlier this week from fireworks smoke, which is always a pretty dramatic show. But honestly, the air quality right now is not as bad as it could be during a heat wave of this magnitude in a lot of areas. Right now, unless you're right near a fire, air quality is mostly okay, considering the record-breakingness of this heat wave. So there are some things I want to show on screen. I'll share them momentarily. I will take a look, and you can always see the URLs, the websites I'm using, by the way, if you want to check these out yourself. They should show up on the screen share as well. But just wanted to point out, that this is a record-breaking heat wave, and just because it wasn't the hottest day that you've ever observed at your house, there are people in California who have experienced not only the hottest day that they've ever experienced, but also the hottest day that their parents or grandparents ever would have experienced, not just anecdotally, but according to the actual record. But of course, the more important thing being the slightly less extreme but very persistent level of heat that's affecting far more people. Today will probably be the hottest day of the heat wave, by the way, across most of the interior of California. Tomorrow could be similarly hot and maybe even a little bit hotter in some parts of the southeastern California deserts and in places like Las Vegas, which could hit a new all-time record high early this coming week. But even as this heat wave fades, it's only going to do so very slowly, with temperatures remaining well above average and in inland areas well above 100 degrees for really the foreseeable future. I don't really see any obvious major break in this heat wave, except that it will relent. It won't be as extreme next week as it is this week, but it's still going to be a continuation of well above average temperatures across inland areas indefinitely. I don't really see an obvious end to that right now. I'll show you some details about that in a moment. So I'm going to share my screen now so that I can see how temperatures have changed. I don't know exactly since I've been talking to you for the past 15 minutes. Let's see what's going on. So this is the MesoWest website, a network of loosely affiliated weather observing sites throughout the western United States. Right now the map is zoomed into California. As you can see, I'm going to get my screen drawing tool here. Well, first of all, up by Redding, the observation just before the hour, just before we started, was 118 degrees. Again, pointing out that is the hottest temperature ever observed in Redding. So that ties, informally at least for now, the all-time record high there. Let's see what happens if I refresh. It's still 118. So this has been sustained long enough. It probably does officially tie the record. Let's see if it's gotten up any higher. So no, the peak is still 118. It's at the peak. We'll see what happens next. But Red Bluff, no slouch either at 117. It looks like it did actually briefly get up to 118 there as well. Technically, the all-time record in Red Bluff is a little higher. I believe it's 121, pretty incredibly. So we're a little farther away from that all-time record, although I do think that 118 would be the new July monthly record for Red Bluff as well. So, and again, it's only essentially 3 p.m. We're still pretty close to the summer solstice, so there's at least a couple more hours of potential heating along with compressional downslope flow in bursts at the north end of the valley. So I would not be surprised to see the final high temperature today be a degree or two higher than this yet to come. So we'll see what's going on. Further south in the valley, temperature's not quite so extreme, although, Chico, no slouch at 108, 109 in Oroville. And look at this, 110 in Fairfield. That is quite hot for being so close to the Delta. Sacramento at 108, and temperature's still rising. Look at this, though. Ukiah, 115. I am not entirely sure what the all-time record high is for Ukiah, and this is probably getting to be within a few degrees of it, with a few hours of heating still to go. So it's possible that Ukiah could get close. In fact, I think I can probably verify this. This map hasn't updated for the past couple hours. By the way, there's a couple of outliers. It's not 32 degrees Fahrenheit on San Nicolas Island off the coast of Southern California, for example, nor is it 116 degrees in Mississippi, fortunately. So a couple of outlying data points here, but the main point is look at all those red dots. And red dots are places where records are being broken, yellow dots and orange dots, places where we're close. There's a lot of them in California right now, and there will probably be more shortly. Emigrant Gap up in the Sierra, for example, up in the low 90s, which essentially ties the hottest July temperature observed. I'm just trying to find Ukiah since this hasn't updated most recently. Let's just see if I can do a Control F. Okay, yes, so I believe this is informal, but the highest, all-time highest recorded temperature in the last 68 years, which is the period of formal record for Ukiah, 116, so we may be within a degree of that as well. So there's potentially a few spots that could break the all-time record, perhaps even during this hour. Just to put this into perspective, I know people get caught up in the statistics, but it's not great when temperatures break all-time records. It's bad for us, it's bad for ecosystems, it's bad for a lot of things. So, I think people are interested in the records. It's definitely worth reporting on and thinking about. But to keep in mind that this really is a problem for a lot of people and a lot of systems out there. If this were just happening once and it were a fluke, that might be one thing, but we know, of course, that in a warming climate, we're seeing more and more warm temperature records all the time. So it's precisely because this is part of a trend, something that we do expect to keep happening, that makes this concerning in the first place. So I'll keep checking back in with this Meso-West map during the hour to see Reading briefly back down at all the way down to 117 for the moment. It's been bouncing around 117, 118 for a while. We'll check back then shortly. I wanted to quickly go to Palm Springs, where the temperature is currently a chilly 113 degrees. I say that tongue-in-cheek, of course, because yesterday at this time temperatures were above 120 and on their way to 124, which broke the all-time record. So it doesn't look like Palm Springs is going to set a new record today. Then again, the last time they set an all-time record was yesterday, so there is that. Looking in the San Joaquin Valley, we see some spots now getting up above 110, so Fresno up to 111, that's getting close certainly to the daily record. Surprisingly, some places like Fresno, the all-time record is not as high as even Sacramento or some other spots, so this is actually, we may get within at least a few degrees of all-time records in some parts of the San Joaquin Valley today, although they're less likely to break it. We go to the coast, we go to, here's Monterey Airport, 63 degrees, so that may even be under the fog with a light north wind at 8 miles an hour. That's why there's so many people at the beach. I don't believe this number, Fort Ord saying 52 degrees. I think that might be an error. I'm not sure if that's plausible. Inland, you go to Hollister, it's 95. Salinas, a genuinely pleasant 72. So you can see why people are at the beach. San Jose airport, not cool, 95 degrees and even a little bit humid with that dew point up around 60 degrees. We go to Half Moon Bay, temperatures in the low 60s. So we see Livermore, 109, so quite hot, and temperatures still rising there, 109. So pretty toasty. Up in the North Bay, again, up by near 100 degrees in some parts of Sonoma County. So it's getting up there. Eureka, 72 degrees. That doesn't sound that hot, but actually for being on the beach, right on the beach as the observing site is north of McKinleyville officially, that's actually quite warm. That may even be a daily record high. So everything is in context, of course. And then looking a little bit just at some adjacent states, it's very hot. Oh, that's right, the Meso-West, maybe perhaps that does not go. Oh no, I just need to remove the state tag and the URL. I think then, yeah, okay. Whoops, I guess I needed to be explicit about the state. Now we're in Utah. Let's go to, I guess they only show up one state at a time, which is a little bit surprising. Maybe there's let's see. This is what happens when you do it live. Let's see what happens if I go to the south, the full southwest. That's just Arizona, New Mexico, so there must be some Pacific Northwest. There we go. Let's see what happens if I go up north. Okay, so yes, as you can see up in Oregon, record-breaking heat right now in Rogue Valley, Medford, almost 110 Grants Pass. Up in Portland, on its way past 100 degrees potentially today. That used to be a really extraordinary number, and we've been seeing it awfully often in recent years. Not quite as hot up by Seattle, but down in Tacoma, 90 degrees. I mean, these are quite hot for this portion of the coast, and you'll see why later when I show you just how pronounced this ridge is across the west. Okay, so going back to the California view, since this is the one that's likely to be of the most interest, I'm going to take a look at comments real quick and then go back to some of these maps here in a moment. Welcome, folks. Again, this is another pretty highly attended session. At the beginning of the chat session here, I offered a couple of ways for folks to help support the channel, including subscribing, sharing, and some other options, so feel free to check that out while I check out the comments myself. Jeff points out the all-time high in Ukiah was from that September 2022 heat wave, 117. So we're still close, and it's still conceivable we get there again today. So we'll see. We'll see what happens with that. Okay, so let's see. I'm going to share some more maps. Let's see what else we've got. This might be too close to the hour. Let's see if this changed, and that's still the previous hour. All right, so looking at some satellite imagery, I'm going to get my drawing tool open so you can see things on the screen as I draw a little bit. Obviously, California near the center of the image, you can see that there is some marine stratus offshore, but notably there is none along the coast from about Marin County northward right now. It has all burned off. I know some meteorologists don't like the term burn off, but obviously it's not literally burning off, but figuratively, it does seem to evaporate and disappear into thin air, and so close enough for the analogy. Anyway, one thing that is notable is the lack of enormous smoke plumes across most of the region. I'm not even going to jinx it because it's not fully true, because if you look closely, there is one now burning in Utah, and then of course there is this one along the central coast. I'll zoom in there for a moment. But right now, there are some smaller fires in the Sierra Nevada, but it's pretty clear. These are pretty clear skies, as well as some smaller fires up in northwestern California and southern Oregon. None of them big yet. That might change, though, sooner rather than later, so I guess we should enjoy it while we can in terms of the air quality. But if I zoom in, here is what I'm talking about in Southern California. I believe this is, and I'll jump over to the Watch Duty page just for a moment to double check the name of that fire, since that's what I thought. It's the Lake Fire. Most recent update, it's over 12,000 acres, so this is a big one. This started just yesterday, so less than 24 hours to get over 10,000 acres, not surprising. Again, this is near Sycamore Valley Ranch. I believe that's of Michael Jackson fame, but anyway, it's also potentially going to burn into a large area of wilderness that most recently burned during the Zaka fire. I think that was now a while ago, 15, 17 years, something like that. So there is a very large burned footprint, but not that recently anymore. 17 years, that brings us through a lot of droughts and a lot of wet years. So, the whole area has regrown to an extent that it'll support fire activity. Will it burn as intensely as it would have 17 years ago? Perhaps not, because there's simply not as much fuel. There's 17 years worth instead of 75 years worth, which was the last time there was a major fire in this region. Nonetheless, there's definitely enough for this fire to spread over quite a large region. So we'll see. Could eventually, depending on the direction the winds blow, threaten some more populated areas closer to the 101 corridor, or if it gets really big out in the wilderness, probably won't threaten too many people directly, but could be quite large and a feature potentially of Southern California weather and climate for weeks to come, if not even longer. So that's one consideration. There are red flag warnings in effect in places where there are the red zones and the red counties on the map. There are, of course, lots of little fire ignitions right now. Most of them are small. The next biggest one is this lightning-ignited fire up in the Southern Sierra. Still burning, still some evacuations in effect, but there aren't very many people who live up in that spot. There have been a couple of fires that have, unfortunately, burned some homes. There was the French fire near really almost within Mariposa. Frankly, this was a good save by Cal Fire. You can see this was a slope and fuels-driven fire that just skirted town. It did burn some structures, but if this had played out slightly differently, there could have been major structural loss in Mariposa, and it was relatively modest. So this fire is not out yet. There are still some evacuations in effect, but it seems likely at this point that most of the structural loss, if not all, that was going to occur with this already did. So despite the folks who did lose their homes, it could have been a lot worse given the setting and the conditions. Similar story up on the Thompson fire near Oroville Reservoir, which even burned onto some of the dam slope on some of the grass growing there. This also destroyed some structures, but not very many, which again was a good catch given that this could have moved into pretty highly populated wild and urban interface zone on the east side of Oroville. So it barely made some inroads. There were some structures burned, but not a large number. So this sort of gets me to my other point, which is that right now what we're seeing are, and I'm gonna bring the temperature map back and refresh it just to see what's going on. Okay, Reading's back up to 118. Really what I want to emphasize, and perhaps for now I'll bring my face back up for the moment so you can see me talking about this. There I am. Is that there have been a lot of good catches. What's a good catch? Well, really, it's a fire that had pretty obvious potential to cause a lot of harm to a lot of people, either because it was in very close proximity to a lot of people or had the potential to get big quickly under adverse weather conditions, and yet it was kept within a day or two within its relatively modest perimeter, not blowing up to 20, 30, 50, 100,000 plus acres like we've seen during some fires in recent years in California, and instead being caught relatively fast. The reason for this, there's several reasons. One is that people forget, it's still early July. This is still early in fire season. Vegetation, although it is approaching now record dry levels at lower elevations in terms of grass and brush, it is not at record dry levels at upper elevations, and even record dry levels, quote unquote, at lower elevations right now is relative to the time of year. So record dryness in early July is still not as dry as it may be later this season in August, September, or October, which is when the seasonal peak in vegetation dryness is reached. So we still have that advantage, particularly in the live fuels and in heavier fuels at higher elevations. There still is the residual effect of a wet winter that's helping us out. That's not the case anymore with the dry cured grasses or the heavier fuels at lower elevations, south-facing slopes. Those are getting awfully dry. But there are reprieves, and that is helping when we're seeing these fires. The other reality is that some of the worst fires in California tend to occur when two things are overlapping. One is vegetation needs to be really dry. We're there now, but then you also need to have strong winds, and also usually some degree of resource drawdown, meaning that there aren't enough firefighting resources to go around to all of the numerous new ignitions that are happening, and so you start to miss some of them. You can't effectively address all of them as quickly as you would need to prevent at least a handful of them from going bad. Right now, although it's been breezy and record hot and dry, we've not seen super strong winds. As you'd expect, it's July. This isn't super strong wind season. That usually waits for September or October or later in Southern California. So these fires, they've been burning in very hot conditions, very dry conditions, but not extremely windy conditions, which has been a saving grace. And also, resources have relatively been relatively available. Like Cal Fire's been able to throw really aggressive air resources at these initial fires. Every fire gets its own helicopters and its air tankers right now because they're available. And because of the lack of very strong wind conditions, they're generally able to fly. If you start getting really strong wind conditions, it's often not safe to fly those aircraft, those firefighting aircraft, near fires. And so you lose that even if they theoretically would be available otherwise. So we're benefiting from the fact that this is low wind season, even though it's extremely hot and dry. We're seeing lots of ignitions, and we're catching most of them right now before they cause huge problems. That may continue to be the case, although with a couple of exceptions. The fire in Santa Barbara County, that one's likely going to go big. There's a couple of small starts up in remoter parts of northwestern California that have the potential to go big too, depending on how the initial day or two goes. But really my main concern, right now is, I don't think right now my big concern is 100,000 acre fires for the next month or so. It's mainly the small fires in the wild and urban interface that have the potential to burn structures, potentially quite a few, in the initial hours. Because right now, within a day or two, we seem to still be able to get a pretty good handle on most of the fires that are popping up, at least in populated areas. And that may continue to be the case for a while for the regions I just mentioned. The big risk is if you have a fire in a neighborhood and it's really hot and breezy, you don't necessarily have a day to figure it all out. You have a matter of minutes to hours, and that's where we have started to see some structural losses from fires this year. So that's sort of where the big concern is for the remainder of this heat wave, is in these not necessarily huge fires, although there could be a couple depending on how things go, but in these rapidly evolving fires in the urban interface. That's really where it's also where there's often more grass and brush relative to trees in most of the interface in California. That's not true everywhere. It's definitely not true in the foothills or up in some of the mountain towns, but that's the fuel model that's of most concern right now, and it's most responsive to record-breaking heat over long periods, as we're seeing right now. But my concern is really what this means for the season to come. July may continue to look kind of like it does right now in terms of fires, which is to say elevated above average activity, but nothing widely catastrophic. It's always hard to predict, and you never know, and the caveat could be if you get one of those fires that starts in the WUI and burns a lot of structures in the WUI, that could happen. But my bigger concern is what happens from September through October, or even into November again this year, when fuels are going to reach peak seasonal dryness, and they may actually be near record levels for peak seasonal dryness, which is saying quite a lot, during offshore wind season. Because that's when we have the potential for things to really go sideways. We have the strong winds, and we have the very strong, very dry fuels, and we potentially have competition with other western states for resources in terms of firefighting aircraft and crews. That's really where we're headed. I think we started off with quite a mild fire season in May. It became a little more active in June, but nothing extraordinary. Now in July in California is definitely above average, but nothing we haven't seen before. Where I'm really concerned about is August through October, because the current really prolonged, record-breaking in some cases, heat wave is setting that stage. We had a wet winter, we had 2 wet winters in a row in California. We're still benefiting from the legacy of that at higher elevations, but at lower elevations the legacy is to have allowed a lot of extra vegetation to grow. Now all that extra vegetation is drying out to near record or record dry levels, and they will get even drier by fall once we do get closer to that wind season. So it's that overlap between potentially record dry vegetation in a month or so and the ordinary seasonal winds, those offshore warming and drying winds, the Santa Ana winds, the Diablo winds, the Jarbo Gap winds, all of these winds that have different names or are unnamed depending on where you are in California. That's, I think, where we're likely to see some issues. Could we get lucky? Could there be a really early season rain event that saves the day? It's always possible, although I think it's even less likely than usual this year. Could there be a real absence of offshore wind events? That is also possible, although in an average year, I'm only really factoring in an average number and strength of offshore wind events with potentially record dry vegetation. So if we come in below average with the wind events, sure, that would certainly help. If we get an early rain event, that would certainly help. But if anything, I think it's less likely than usual we're going to get those early breaks this year, and that is why I'm more concerned about August through October than I am about the current fire situation, even though it is escalating right now, and even though some people have lost their homes already this year in California due to wildfire. We haven't seen the kind of large-scale losses from extremely fast-moving, wind-driven, record drought, fuel dryness-driven fires that we saw back in the 2010s. We could see something closer to that this fall, although you can't make specific predictions, so I'm not making one. I'm just saying that the conditions will potentially be conducive to that kind of fire behavior in a couple of months. And they haven't been for at least several years because of the wet and relatively mild conditions we've seen. Those mild conditions are definitely in the rearview window as I hold the session and talk about some places in California literally breaking their all-time record high temperatures as I speak. So just some context from the fire world. So I'm actually going to go take a look at that again just to see where we've ended up with those temperatures and how they've evolved this hour. It's still 118 degrees in Redding, which again is the hottest temperature. It's tied for the hottest temperature observed there in its period of record. Check back in there in a little bit. Ukiah holding at 115. There's still room to go up a few degrees in some spots. Okay, I'm going to take a look at some questions, and then I got a little more map showing for folks before we get to the end of the hour. Yeah, there's a couple people remarking that this is a time to do deep watering, so don't just sprinkle your plants, but really, especially trees and brush. This helps, by the way, both from a fire risk perspective and for keeping your garden alive. Forget the lawn. It's probably a goner if it's already on the way out. But yeah, you do probably want to do some deep watering of your trees and your shrubs that you really want to keep alive, or that you want to maintain higher live fuel moisture. Because that can help reduce the flammability of the vegetation if a fire does come along. So deep watering trees and shrubs can really help during events like this. Question, if I'm seeing a cold front coming through on Friday, it would be extremely unusual to see a cold front really this time of year at all in California, and no, I don't see one on the horizon. I will show you some maps about what I think might be coming next, but cold front is not on the list, unfortunately. Kevin asks, can you explain 1.5 degrees Celsius and we can't turn it back around a presidential statement? No, I can't. I actually don't know where this comes from. I would need some more context to comment more on that. I presume it relates to global warming temperature target levels, but I don't really know the context of that statement. Some folks reporting, Joyce says 111 degrees at 1:26 p.m. in the hills east of Napa. Not surprising. Looks terrible. 114 in the backyard, in the shade in Palmdale from Gracie. By the way, if you're measuring temperatures, the correct way to measure them is always in the shade. So when you hear about the temperatures on the news or the weather forecast, those are shade temperatures. Because if you have a thermometer in direct sunlight, what you're doing is measuring the temperature of the surface of the thermometer in direct sunlight. So imagine touching a black dashboard inside a car on a hot day. That is not representative of the air temperature. So kudos to the shade temperature, because that is actually the correct way to measure it and the way that all of these temperatures are being reported. So for example, when I say that Redding is 118, that means that it is 118 degrees by definition in the shade. 116 at 2,900 feet in the Southern Sierra. That is a very high number. Hard to say whether that's a shade temperature or a fully radiation shielded thermometer, but the point is, it is freaking hot out there. Another one, 115 up in eastern Trinity County at 2,000 feet. That is very hot, and frankly, Ukiah is about 2,000 feet, and it is officially 115 in the shade, so I have no real reason to doubt that. Eliza mentions that it's 96 Fahrenheit in Los Altos, but with a 66.9 dew point. So that is a really humid air. I will say that home weather station thermometers and hygrometers, hygrometers in particular, are really finicky. It's really hard to get a correct dew point unless you calibrate your machine every year. But based on temperatures and dew point combos in the Bay Area right now, it does look like there are dew points all the way up in the 60s, and that is really humid when you have temperatures in the mid 90s. 101 up in McLeod. Yesterday, up there, 106. Again, this is at a higher elevation in far northern California, so that is really, really hot. Deborah asks if I can recommend a reliable source for temperatures. Well, one is this Meso West map I just showed. The URL will show up again on screen next time I screen share it. Yeah, the weather apps, the same thing about current conditions that the same criticisms I share about forecasts from weather apps applies. Often they're just wrong, and the provenance of the data is highly suspect in almost every case. It just is the way it is. Yeah, 93 degrees up at Big Bear, and again, that's 6,800 feet, so that's quite hot for that elevation. All right, here, let's see if there's any other questions before I go back to some map sharing here. Oh yes, the Zaca fire in Santa Barbara County, where it's probably going to overlap with some of the burned area from that with the ongoing lake fire right now. That was 2007, so it's not quite 20 years, but we're getting there. So that's plenty of time for chaparral and grass in particular to regrow. Not timber up at the top of the mountains, but certainly saplings. I don't know what the tree regrowth actually has been in that footprint. All right, let's see a few more questions here. Oh, yeah, Toby asks, if I haven't already, could I explain the thermal belt phenomena? Yeah, so when I refer to the thermal belt, it's sort of an elevation band. Usually, it depends on the situation, but often it's between about 1 and 3,000 feet elevation. Sometimes it's as low as 500 feet, which I think we may have seen during this event. Sometimes it's even a little bit higher. But it's an elevation where temperatures at night don't drop below levels that are much higher than the valleys below or sea level. So in other words, it represents the height of the inversion. It's essentially the elevation at which those temperatures in the overnight hours reach the maximum temperature. So usually in the atmosphere, temperatures are warmest at the surface and they get progressively colder all the way up to the top of the troposphere and into the stratosphere. But in an inversion, you actually have some layer of the atmosphere where temperatures get warmer with height. So it starts out colder at the surface and then gets warmer. That can happen in winter because the valleys will radiate a lot of energy out to space in a clear night. So this is why the valleys may get a hard freeze or frost, but the hills above will not be as cold because you have whatever radiation is cooling the surface on the slopes of the hills and mountains. It flows downhill in a density-driven current and accumulates in the valley like water flowing downhill. So all of that energy that's lost from the surfaces in the middle elevations, you kind of have an isothermal temperature, and all of that cool air goes to the bottom of the valley. This, by the way, is why vineyards are located often on slopes. So in wine country in California, this is true in Europe, really everywhere where there is major wine grape growing. You get those vineyards on slopes because it tends to be a strongly protective effect. Well, at least the fanciest wine grapes grow on the sloped land because there's even a microclimate over the course of that single hill slope, which is usually less dramatically cold in winter than the valley below. In summer, though, what this can mean is that because that air mass doesn't really cool off, that's sort of the air mass that is particularly hot, that's sort of at the base of that subsiding air in the strong ridge that I mentioned. That 1 to 3,000 foot level is sort of right where that is. And so if you're in that zone, you have hot, dry air compressing downward from above, and you have air from below that inversion. It's either marine air that's a little bit cooler, or it's, again, you still lose radiation energy to space via radiation even in summer. that those valleys cool off a little bit more and you're closer to sea level, but you're stuck in those mid-ranges. All of your cool air is draining into the valley, and you're just staying warm because you're getting that compression from above. So there's a bunch of processes going on, but that's what the thermal belt is. And during this heat wave, there are places where temperatures at night are not getting down much below 80 degrees or even 85 degrees. In fact, there's a few spots last night, I suspect around 2,000 feet, that did not get below 90 degrees at night. So the coolest temperature in a 24-hour period did not fall below 85 to 90 degrees in some of these spots. That's why this is such a problem. This is also why those places are just drying out like crazy from a vegetation moisture perspective, because it's not just 100, 110 degrees in the day, but it's also 85 to 90 degrees straight throughout the night. So you're maintaining that evaporation from the soil. Most plants, of course, are not transpiring at night because you don't have the sunlight for photosynthesis, but you're definitely losing that moisture straight throughout the night, still through certainly dead vegetation and also the soil itself. So you're really just drying things out 24 hours a day under that scenario. All right, let's see. All right, I'm gonna go back to the map, take a look, see what's going on again. You'll see my face go away again. Okay, I'm gonna update this since this needs to be manually updated. Reading still at 118, Red Bluff at 117. Though look at Ukiah 117, which, if that is official, that would be the all-time record in Ukiah, tied. So right now, we currently have Ukiah and Reading both tying, as we speak, their all-time high-temperature records. Both of them would set a new all-time high with 1 additional degree of warming. As I was saying, could still happen during the session, depending on how things update. We shall see. But these are really extraordinary temperatures to see. I mean, Ukiah, again, the Ukiah station, I misspoke actually. The station Ukiah is more at 600 feet elevation, so that is a bit lower. But then again, now it's up to 117, so could it be 115, up another 1,500 feet? Perhaps so. That's a very high value. Reading up at 118. Just making sure I've refreshed this page to the most recent value. I mean, those are, these are really extraordinary values. I know it may not sound as extreme. Sacramento Airport is merely at 111 degrees, although if you look at that temperature curve, it's still increasing, so that may already be a daily record on our way closer to July monthly records, since this is hotter than yesterday now. So Sacramento 111, Ukiah 117, Red Bluff 117, Reading 118. These are just incredibly hot values. Going into the San Joaquin Valley, Bakersfield 111, Fresno 111. A lot of 110s out there right now. Lemoore 112. Fairfield 110 again. So I'll keep an eye on this while I continue the session. But just to give a sense, by the way, on the satellite imagery, where this fire really is, I'll bring my drawing tool back briefly. This is, you can see this is the infrared imagery. So clearly it's burning not super intensely right now, but this is probably going to pop up later this evening as well. It's a pretty big fire already, and it's burning in a pretty remote spot. So I don't think we've seen the last of this one. Also noticing a small fire just south of the border in Mexico. But if I go up to Northern California, no news is good news here in terms of hot spots. There is a small one, a very modest one, looks like, up by Placerville, but this one not super distinct. That could well be one that gets caught today. Go a little farther north into far northern California, and I don't see too much on the map right now. So, from that perspective, no news is good news. Up in Southern Oregon, same story. So, we'll see how that unfolds. So what is going to unfold in the coming days? All right, so this is a map showing the 500 millibar geopotential height anomaly, meaning the degree of unusualness of the heat of the lower half of the atmosphere across the western United States. You can see right now the ridge is centered right over Northern California, Southern Oregon, and it's peaking right now. So this is this morning, this is this evening. The ridge is peaking as we speak, and although it will very gradually weaken, it's going to expand as it does so. So this is going into Sunday. Still very strong ridge all up and down the west coast. Record high is still possible in many areas. Monday, still very strong. Some more record highs possible. It does start to fade in magnitude, at least, by late Monday into Tuesday. Although it's still there, it's not really going away. In fact, it even starts to intensify a little bit in the southeastern California deserts again by the middle of the week, and across the Central Valley again. So there may be yet another third or maybe a fourth mini peak in heat midweek this week across the Central Valley and southeastern California. It won't be as hot as the previous one, but it might get back up to 110 degrees in some parts of the Central Valley once again. Heat continuing to the end of the week. So this is the third or fourth wave of the heat wave, depending on how you count it. Then it fades away again by next weekend, but once again, it's still not completely gone. This is still an unusually strong ridge across all of the western U.S., and it just keeps going. So we're at mid-July. This is July 16th, 10 days out. A weaker signal, to be sure, than we currently have. So probably some relief, especially along the coast as we get towards mid-July. But notice, these are still higher than usual values across almost all of the West. So I think this will be less of a coastal heat wave situation. But right now, the European model ensemble suggests it could start rebuilding again as we get toward the end of the month. So what does that look like in terms of smooth temperatures? Here's where we are right now. Obviously an extreme heat wave along the West Coast all the way from Southern California up into British Columbia. That persists, and we get into mid-July. It fades along the immediate coast, but we still have anomalous heat inland. We get some relief, delta breeze maybe, so the southern Sacramento Valley, Bay Area will cool off, but northern mountains, Sierra Nevada, southeastern deserts, there just doesn't really look like there's going to be much relief. And then even here, the extreme heat shifts across the northern Rockies, so we could get fire season going up there. This is the European model. If we look at the American model ensemble, I need to go back a run to make sure you can see everything. The same general pattern. Most extreme heat right now. It fades somewhat but remains above average, and then maybe even resurges a bit across the continental west interior, getting towards late July. So not a lot of obvious relief on the horizon. Okay, so this map, I like this page. This is cool weather, spelled WX, so coolwx.com/record. It's kind of a cool little website. These are informal numbers, by the way, but they give you a sense of the record-breakingness of current temperatures. It updates every hour. You can see the most dramatic symbol, the black X, is starting to show up now. I believe that's probably Reading, so let's scroll down and see. So this Ukiah temperature hasn't updated yet. It was up to 112 the last time this recorded, but Reading, as we were talking about, up to 118. That ties the all-time record in Reading. See if we get a degree higher. Palmdale, apparently, in the high desert, Antelope Valley, that also appears to be tying the all-time high temperature record. That's a shorter period of record. That's only got 47 years of data, but still saying that today is the hottest day in the last 47 years at least in Palmdale is, Palmdale's not a cool place. Spent a summer there. So right now, according to this data set, there's 2 places currently tying their all-time high temperatures. I think there are probably more. Ukiah may be one of them, and they would only need to go a degree higher to break the all-time record. Even places still in Southern California, Sandberg, not the all-time record, but on its way, close. This is already breaking the July record. Emigrant Gap continuing to break its July record, and then a whole litany of other places getting close to monthly records. But you can see this is a broad heat wave all the way from the interior Southern California deserts all the way up toward Portland, which is also breaking a record high currently. All right, what is the new Meso-West data? This updates more frequently. Still 118 in Reading, 117 in Ukiah. I'll probably check back in one more time before leaving, so take another look at questions. Share my face once again for a moment. All right, let's see here. How does this compare in rarity and intensity versus the 2021 Pacific Northwest heat wave? It's nowhere near the relative anomalousness as that event. Just to give you some context for how mind-blowingly ridiculous that heat wave was, this one pales in comparison. Because right now we're talking about breaking all-time record high temperatures in a couple of locations in California by a degree or two, perhaps. Still highly notable and historic. But the 2021 event shattered all-time records by 5 to 10 degrees in quite a few places, bringing completely previously unseen temperatures to a wide region. So we're not seeing that here. This is a more, I guess, typical record-breaking heat wave in a warming climate type scenario than we would typically expect to see with a 2021-like event. A 2021-like event in Northern California would bring temperatures probably well into the 120s across a good portion of the Central Valley, just for perspective. I hope we don't see it, but to be quite honest, we probably will someday on our warming climate trajectory. But this is not that event. And we would have warning, and we would be pretty clear that it was coming. The 2021 event, by the way, was predicted very well in advance to be kind of mind-blowingly hot up in the Pacific Northwest. This event, despite what your weather app may have told you, never had any indication that it was going to be 125 degrees in Sacramento, despite what Apple Weather said on multiple occasions. And, of course, it isn't. It's extremely hot. There are a couple of places that are essentially tying or slightly exceeding their all-time record highs, but still, it's a far cry from 125 in Sacramento. Currently, it's about 110 to 112 in Sacramento, which is very hot, but it isn't 125. And be grateful that it's not, I guess. But beware where you get your weather information. A lot more temperature reports. Pretty much it's hot everywhere unless you're in places like Monterey or near the immediate upwelling along the coast. And in some cases it's quite humid, in other places it's not. So this is an interesting heat wave in the sense that it's neither extremely dry nor extremely humid everywhere. It really depends where you are. Some places it is notably grossly muggy, and other places it's actually extremely dry. So your location really matters as to your experience during this event in particular. All right. Well, that may be the bulk of the comments today, but I do want to continue to check on maybe one last time whether there's any new numbers. So it's still 118 in Reading. I think there's a pretty good chance, frankly, that with the amount of daytime heating left, it's about 4 p.m. There should be at least a degree or so left in the tank. So at a minimum, Reading has tied its all-time record high temperature today. Still could tip it over. It looks like Ukiah has done the same, and the same would be true there. So we'll see if that continues. Palmdale also potentially tying its record high temperature today, potentially with another hour or two of heating left. So Palmdale breaking its previous all-time record high yesterday. So again, this is a major heat event, and it isn't going to quickly fade away. Some events will taper off quickly with major relief immediately, and this isn't going to be one of them. In fact, as the heat fades a little bit next week, and places like the southern Sacramento, northern San Joaquin Valley, and the Delta get a bit of a sea breeze. I think one of the Weather West regulars has called this the Melta breeze to describe the fact it's actually quite a hot wind, and that might well be sort of how this heat wave tapers off without really abruptly ending, but still seeing temperatures some days above 100 degrees, but perhaps with the wind and humidity that you don't normally see combined with that, as that marine influence comes in with a very strong ridge remaining aloft on top of it, so that moisture marine air sandwiched below a layer of very hot temperatures at higher elevations that might sort of be the signature of how this heat wave in the Central Valley continues into the middle of this coming week. All right, one last check of the temperatures, and then I think I'm gonna call it a day. I'll still be online, keeping an eye on things, but gotta move on to some other things at the moment. Still 118 in Redding and 117 in Ukiah, so you can keep track on the Meso West page yourself. And otherwise, thanks for watching. I think I forgot to mention at the beginning of the session, so I will reiterate that ReAsk, a company that's rethinking Earth system risk, is a partial sponsor of the Weather West channel, and so too can you be a partial sponsor of the channel through your several options: sharing the channel, subscribing to the channel, or contributing to it directly via any of the links at the beginning of the comment section. So thank you again. Stay cool, seriously. This is a dangerous heat wave, and it isn't going to be over very quickly. And I'll try and check in with folks later this week. See you then.